to the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. As people are joining, please take a moment and let us know where you're joining from in the chat. I'm Branda Anderson, the Holocaust Center for Humanities Teaching and Learning Specialist. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge the Cochise people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands on the land which we now call Seattle. Living in harmony with the lands and the waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years, these people and groups continue to live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations. To quote Chief Seattle in 1854, every part of this soil is sacred in the estimation of my people. Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove has been hallowed by some sad or happy event and days long vanished. I am honored to step in today for our CEO, Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, and lead today's Lunch and Learn, which features Dr. Doyle Stevick, the founding executive director of the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina, and associate professor of leadership, learning, design, and inquiry. The Anne Frank Center is the official partner of the Anne Frank House for the United States and Canada and operates peer education programs and traveling exhibits across both countries. Doyle was a Fulbright Fellow in Estonia in 2003 and 2013 and 14. He has completed degrees in mathematics, history, and classical studies at Penn State, and completed his PhD from Indiana University with a focus on comparative and international education. His first two books address democratic citizenship education across the world, and the next four concern Holocaust education, including As Witnesses Fall Silent, 21st Century Holocaust Education and Curriculum, Policy, and Practice for UNESCO's International Bureau of Education, and most recently, Exploring Anne Frank and Difficult Life Stories from Routledge. Welcome, Doyle. As I mentioned before, sorry about your university's recent loss in the national championship game. Well fought for South Carolina. Thank you for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for being here with me today. Yes, when you heard I'm from USC, I know you immediately thought of the University of South Carolina and not our younger namesake on your coast. We're the original. We love our younger namesake too, but I like to think of us as original Coke and new Coke. So here we are. If we say, I'm from USC. We can have a conversation where I say one thing, you understand something completely different. That's a theme that I'll try to address here today. What I'd like to do is share a bit of my experience, the questions it raised, and how it led me into this work. If you took the 50 million Americans 30 years ago who were most likely to end up leading the Anne Frank House's partner in the United States, I probably wouldn't have been on that list. I was happy working around the Mediterranean, doing archaeology, studying Greek and Latin in graduate school. And I had found quite a congenial lifestyle, really. I can't complain about the Mediterranean. But in 1999, I was in Bloomington, Indiana, working on a PhD, and someone threw a white supremacist pamphlet in my driveway. And I remember opening it and thinking, what absurd nonsense, that I'd stop and take some time, really dissect it and show what absurd stuff it is. And I didn't kind of stop to think at the time, this makes sense to somebody. Like somehow this resonates with somebody. And I stored it somewhere, and the semester got busy, and I kind of forgot about it. And April 20th, which happened to be Hitler's birthday, is when the Columbine attacks were, and that kind of threw us all off and changed our imagination of what kind of violence was possible in our own society. That pamphlet I ended up pitching, and by the time I discovered that it was my own student who had thrown it there, it was already too late. July 4th weekend, 1999, my former student in my Latin class had failed out. Turns out he had fallen in with a white supremacist cult, thought there was nothing he could do better with his young life than to try to start a race war. And he ambushed 6 men and boys on the way to services at a synagogue on Friday night in Chicago. They survived, fortunately. Juan Jun Yoon, a Korean exchange student near my house in Bloomington, and Ricky Birdsong, the black basketball coach at Northwestern University, were not so fortunate. He ended up shooting 11 people before he killed himself in a gun battle with police. And that shook up everything I thought I knew and understood about the nature of racism, the power of education. And I really struggled to make sense of that. Within 9 months, my man from my neighborhood in Pittsburgh does the same thing. Gets up one day, murders his Jewish neighbor, desecrates a synagogue, kills a black man in a karate dojo, and then murders immigrants from India and Vietnam in a grocery store and restaurant. And it was the same pattern I later discovered. It was this Nazi concept of Untermensch, underman, subhuman. And it made me think 55 years after Auschwitz was liberated, is the Holocaust completely over if the ideology that motivated is still here circulating and impacting not just, neo-Nazis in some remote militia site or the classic KKK members, but these two killers defied my expectations of who the racists were, right? On paper, you couldn't tell them apart from me. These were straight white kids from northern suburban high schools, largely segregated schools, high-performing high schools, go to big public state universities like I did. And it forced me to confront the question, gosh, if I had grown up in the wrong family or fallen in with the wrong circles, gone down the wrong rabbit hole, was there anything in my education that would have, pulled me out or changed my mind? And I, had a excellent education in the traditional sense, but I didn't think there was anything in that education that would have combated that kind of bigotry. And that forced me to ask the question, why not? My first instinct was, didn't we have the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954? As if that was a magic moment and we lived happily ever after. Well, I discovered that it was more complicated than that, right? We had this amazing political and legal transformation in the Brown decision, but we didn't live up to its potential. We didn't fulfill its potential. And as Gloria Ladson-Billings has pointed out, we didn't even fulfill the potential of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Separate but equal. We never got to equal there either. But I realized we had the Brown decision, but we didn't accompany it with any educational effort to combat the segregationism that produced the situation in the first place. So we end up having this decision, and who's in charge of integrating schools at that point? In some southern communities, it was the school boards who wanted segregation in the first place. They're now confronted with having one black math teacher and one white math teacher. So they used integration to fire 30,000 black teachers. So the law is only as good as the attitudes of the culture it's situated within. And that was an important lesson for me. And this fact that we had never made a national effort to combat bigotry through schooling really got me wondering, what would that look like? Well, I left classics and archaeology and I went into education for the purpose of understanding, how do people fall for this stuff and what can we do about it? So I started with those questions, trying to explore these things. And one of the big questions I wanted to know was, what would it have looked like if we had tried a national effort to overcome bigotry through schooling? And you can't research things that don't exist. So I had to look for some kind of parallel case, some huge institutional transformation, legal political transformation that people were trying to fulfill through the education system. And in the late 90s, the biggest transformation on the global horizon was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you have 15 countries spinning out. They're trying to turn into democracies and market economies. And I ended up going to Estonia, which is excelling on all those parameters. I wanted to look at, how are they doing civic education? Are they producing those kind of civic attitudes and dispositions that I think have us learn to deal with differences and respect them and work out compromises, the kinds of things that I think are necessary for a society that doesn't devolve into hate. And I ended up over there only to discover that they had gotten their freedom after 50 years under the Soviet thumb, but without the freedom to learn about history that was being researched in the West, without the freedom to understand their own history, without survivors there to tell their stories and learn from them, they got free. And for many, the Soviets were the bad guys who were clearly lying. But Hitler had presented himself as a liberator during the war, had driven the Soviets out for 3 years, and some still perceived him as such. So this view from their experience of many that the Nazis were liberators and the Soviets were the bad guys. That's a very thumbnail sketch. That's a complicated place to go in and challenge anti-Semitism, try to argue with anti-Semitism or interpretations of the past. And having foreign experts come in and share their perspective didn't do much to change people's attitudes. But I saw the work of the Anne Frank House at that point, and that really impressed me a great deal because more than 40 years ago, they had pioneered the traveling exhibit, and it even went behind the Iron Curtain in Poland, among other places. And they have a story to share. And it's harder to argue with a story with somebody's experience than it is to argue with politics. So it was able to have people who were reluctant or resistant to taking these things in, absorb it, process it, begin to make sense of it. And they did it in a special way. They did it by training students to talk to one another about it. This wasn't a talking head expert like me holding forth on what happened as an expert historian. This was students making sense of someone's experience and talking with each other about what it means today. And that was really a crucial insight I think the Anne Frank House had, because I don't think anyone understands, few understand as well as the Anne Frank House does, the power of young people's voices, right? If you read the diary in school like I did, that was the only time in my entire education where I was learning from somebody my age. And that's a really extraordinary thing. And it's quite powerful. And it's powerful for young people today. Young people today all recognize the negative power of peer pressure. But they often don't think about the flip side or realize the flip side of that coin, and that is their potential to bring out the best in one another. So I was very impressed with the work of the Anne Frank House, working with these traveling exhibits. They had taken this program to 89 different countries. And with this peer education program, because it's not one person transmitting information to another being the authoritative source for everything, although, of course, there's ample expertise there. But it's dialogue, it's cultural exchange, it's conversation where people learn from one another. And I think that model is really the only way change happens. Because in your educational hierarchy, it's easy to transmit facts. We're pretty good at developing skills such as, how do you critique a propaganda photo? But the deeper stuff, getting at attitudes and dispositions, for example, or positively influencing future behavior, those are really challenging educational outcomes to achieve. So that work brought me into contact with the center. I got to work at the Anne Frank House, learned about their work all over the world. Thought I'd write a book about it, but honestly, their staff was so remarkable and engaging. I wanted to bring that work to the U.S. So we started cooperating in 2013 in South Carolina, and one thing led to another. By the time we got to the year 2018, we were running, I think, 6 exhibit copies, and we made an agreement between the university and the Anne Frank House that we would create a permanent partner site of the Anne Frank House in Columbia, South Carolina. And that was really a thrill because the Anne Frank House itself is in Amsterdam, and there are 2 other partner sites. One's in Berlin, one's in Buenos Aires. And to add Columbia, South Carolina to that list seemed natural, right? It's the ABCs of great cities, so natural extension. And we've had the pleasure and honor of working with the Anne Frank House and trying to carry that torch forward ever since. But as I learned about the Anne Frank House, I learned a lot about Otto Frank, how he envisioned it. Here is somebody who had his family murdered, who lost everything. The hiding place was looted by the Nazis and all the property stolen. He came back to an empty place, and he insisted it stay that way. It was not refurnished because I think that emptiness reflected how he felt having lost everything and everyone. But he also insisted it not just be a mausoleum, right? An empty place to remember those who'd been murdered. It had to be a living educational institution embodying Anne's values. And it turns out one of the most creative and innovative educational staffs I've run into. So that's what led me to dedicate my career to this program and spreading it around the United States. As I've learned a lot, I mentioned that cultural dialogue that takes place. We try to bring this history into dialogue with our local histories, and I'll try to illustrate just a little bit what kind of learning we can do from that. So I started with these big education questions about what kind of learning we need to undertake to prevent the kind of hatred that I had been exposed to. And with the technological changes in society, the nature of that challenge has shifted during that time. When somebody threw that ridiculous pamphlet in my yard, you really had to get out to the fringes to find that kind of literature. By the time we got to Dylan Roof, it was just a click away, and he fell down the rabbit hole. That's no longer the case. Today, the algorithms are pushing this stuff at us. So the nature of the challenge has fundamentally changed, and I think we need an educational adjustment that aligns with those changes. So what I'd like to do now, I'd like to illustrate one point that I use to get at some of these kinds of concepts. And then from there, we'll elaborate a little bit about, I think, some of the educational goals that follow from that. So if I could, in this illustration, ask Richard to bring up the first slide here. What I'm going to share now is a map of Europe in the year 1889. And I share this map because of a coincidence and a paradox. Now, this map of Europe looks a little different than the map of Europe you know today, clearly so. And one thing that does look familiar, though, is France. And it's largely the France we know today. 1889 just happens to be the year that the Eiffel Tower was built. So it's memorable for that alone. But something else happened in 1889, and that was the coincidence that Adolf Hitler and Otto Frank were born just 3 weeks apart. Those two men were almost exactly the same age. Now, that's a coincidence. Interesting, but it may be more meaningful because of the paradox that it embodies. And I frame the paradox like this. If these two men were in a room, both of them would say to the other one, "I'm German and you're not." And this gets at the crux of why the Holocaust can be, in part, so difficult to understand for Americans. Now, these two men spoke the same language at the same time, and this word we use to describe them, German, is a word that we use all the time, like it requires no explanation, right? It's a self-evident word. But just like USC a moment ago, we'll find it's actually a bit complicated. So, what was Otto Frank's story? Well, he was born in Frankfurt. His family had roots there for centuries. Germany was his birthplace. He was a German citizen. He spoke the German language. He was part of German culture. So, all of these characteristics we think of German certainly applied to Otto Frank. And Otto Frank would say about Hitler that, well, he was born outside Linz in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So from Otto's point of view, Hitler wasn't German. So what was Hitler's take on things? Hitler spoke German. He felt German. And he's going to introduce a fictional category here. He's going to claim that he's Aryan. And that fictional category is a racial category. And right away, we're into a can of worms here because race has become a pretty politicized concept. But what is it we're actually talking about? Like, what is race? If you had to have an objective scientific definition of it, what would they say? And the tricky answer to that is there isn't a scientific definition of race. Because it's not part of the objective physical world. It's a social category people invented. So we're able to say now, hopefully with relatively clear language, right? Race was an idea. And in its simplest form, race was the idea that some groups are inherently superior to others, or shall we say, naturally superior to others. In other words, based on biology, people believe that some groups of people were morally, intellectually, and physically better than others. Well, the science is clear that there's no basis for this. So we can say clearly race was a biological fiction, but a social reality, right? Race in this sense doesn't exist, but racism does. And we have different colors of skin, but that doesn't mean that all of these ideas that are associated with that have any legitimacy or bearing too. But Hitler's racial ideology was one that said you're either Aryan or Jewish, right? These are mutually exclusive categories. It's either or. So Hitler is defining Jewish people not as a religion, but as a race. And that's a complicated idea to wrap one's mind around because students walk in every day and have the Whoopi Goldberg confusion, right? They'll see a picture of Anne Frank on our wall and they'll think she's white. And that's something that even our 12-year-olds can learn to answer. And here we show the challenge of the logic, right? Anne Frank was Jewish. Anne Frank was murdered because she was Jewish. And it sounds like a logical extension, right? That Anne Frank was murdered for her religion. Well, that's a completely logical series of associations. But in the Nazis' mindset, being Jewish wasn't a religion, it was a race. And so that logical set of steps actually doesn't hold because the Nazi concept of race wasn't based on skin color alone. When the Nazis talk about race, they refer to blood. So you can have somebody like Anne Frank, who, if she were a 95-year-old grandmother in New Jersey today, had she been allowed to immigrate and live, she might be looked at and perceived as and treated as a white person here and now. But in her time where she lived, that language was never applied to her. That wasn't the identity that was imposed on her or inflicted on her in the way that Hitler distorted this notion of Jewish identity from religion to race. So, with that insight in mind, we can go forward to the next slide for a moment. So here we have this map of Europe again. We looked at France, and that's a model of a country, France for French people speaking French, right? One country, one language, one group of people, one government. Much of the rest of Europe at this time is empires. We have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we have the Russian Empire, we have the Ottoman Empire, and of course the German Empire too. And the logic of empire was dominate all the territory you can, no matter who lives there. So these empires were actually quite diverse. They weren't organized just around one group of people. And it becomes instructive to observe another coincidence that parallels life here in the South in the United States. So for many of my students who come in, I can inform them that Jewish life in Europe wasn't in Amsterdam, where Anne was predominantly, right? Jewish life was concentrated in the East. You can see the outline of Poland there as part of the Russian Empire. And at this time, there were more Jews living in that section of the Russian Empire than in the rest of Western Europe put together. So Jewish life was concentrated in the East. And for our students, very few are likely to remember that. But if you build on something they already know, it can stick. And something they know where we live is that Black life in the United States is concentrated in the South. So just as Black life in the US is concentrated in the South, Jewish life was concentrated in the East here. And that leads to a very interesting observation. We know everybody on a call like this, the figure of 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. We've heard it many times to the point where maybe it stops to lose impact and to enlighten the nature of the phenomenon here. So how do we get a new perspective on the devastation that the Holocaust wrought? Well, by coincidence, in the year 1900, the Jewish population of Europe was about identical to the Black population of the United States. In 1900, the black population of the US was 8.8 million people. The Jewish population of Europe was 8.9 million people. So if you flash forward to the present, the black population of the US is around 45 million people. And there's no question this country didn't roll out the red carpet for the black community in the early part of the century. But if you look at what happened with the Holocaust when two-thirds of the Jewish community was murdered, if there are 45 million black people in the US today, in the entire world, there are about 15, 16 million Jewish people. In other words, if the Jewish community had been allowed to develop unharassed through the century, there might be 45 million Jewish people living in Europe alone. So for every living Jewish person, there may be two missing human beings. That's the long-term demographic devastation wrought by the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is exceptionally difficult to understand, hard to deal with. It's hard to understand how a society can convince itself it should murder every member of a group of people. And I don't think I ever want to understand how they got adults to murder 1.5 million children. But there are some questions we can shed light on. One is that the Holocaust is the extreme example of identity-based violence. And so we need to understand a little bit about how identity works to make sense of that. We just spoke a bit about how this racial ideology of Hitler's conceived the Jews as a race and targeted them for elimination as a result. A second question that we can look at is what are some of the long-term origins of the Holocaust or contributing factors of the Holocaust? Well, one of them, of course, is the centuries-old religious anti-Semitism. And there was a horribly prescient article in the New York Times that spoke to that. The New York Times, to my knowledge, is the first publication to print the number 6 million Jewish lives in danger, not killed at this point, but Jewish lives in danger. It said 127,000 Jews have been killed, 6 million are in peril. And from what we know about the Nazis invading the Soviet Union and starting mass murders, then, we might expect that newspaper headline to come from the fall of 1941. But if we flip to the next slide, we'll see this headline here. 6 million are in peril. The extraordinary thing about this article, and let's flip to the next slide again, is that it was printed September 8th, 1919, right? So this extraordinary burst of violence, that number wasn't precisely correct, 127,000, but it shows just how awful the violence was of the pogroms, right? The Nazis don't exist at this point. 4 days after this letter is printed, the German army sends a spy to observe a radical right German nationalist workers' party. And that's the spy was Adolf Hitler, and he fell in and realized that he could excel in those kinds of meetings and took over the party he was first exposed to 4 days after this article was printed. Now, pogroms can be a new word for a lot of American students, but you'll notice they have similarities to the attacks on Black communities in the United States. And by coincidence, right next to this article on pogroms in Europe, we have an article about a mob lynching 2 men in Jacksonville. Okay, so with this pillar of historical religious anti-Semitism as one of kind of the deep roots of the Holocaust, we'll return to a minute to the idea of identity labels like German and the concepts there. So thank you. Generally, how a concept functions is we'll have an identity label, and it could be German, Jewish, Black, white, what have you, and it draws on a set of underlying categories. And the one we just observed on the next slide shows us that the concept of German identity draws on birthplace, citizenship, language, culture, as we know. So if we then look at the next slide, we show how it was distorted, and Hitler introduces this concept of race in his mind to be the defining element of so-called Aryan identity. So to the next slide, please. Okay. So if you subject yourself to Hitler's nonsense, and I started working through some of Mein Kampf a year ago, I found that this quote more or less distills the essence of this worldview. So here it's 307 of the kind of typical English translation that you'll find of Mein Kampf. It boils down to his assertion that Jews are a race, not a religion. What he actually wrote was the first and greatest lie is that the Jews are not a race, but a religion. And you get the core of that reframing of identity in his mind and in that propaganda. Okay, back to the next slide, please. All right. So if race is a fictional category, culture is real. And culture is something that's learned. And anyone can learn anything. And we talked about how racial thinking is this or that, either or, mutually exclusive. So so-called Aryan identity and Jewish identity through this racial lens were conceived of separate things. But that wasn't the reality, right? Otto Frank was clearly German, proud of it. He was a patriot. He served as an officer in the First World War, and absolutely Jewish. And both of these identities existed and were true and real. And this is the distinction. Racial thinking is either or thinking. Cultural thinking, which is real, is both and thinking because you can learn more than one thing. You can be part of multiple communities. It's additive identities. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're back to the map for a moment. We talked about that first pillar of the religious anti-Semitism that existed around Europe. If you can flip to the next slide for a second, just 4 years before, just 4 years before Otto Frank and Adolf Hitler were born in 1885. Germany joined the scramble for Africa. And here you see the German colonies. And this is interesting because it's not maybe deeply widely known, but in that German Southwest Africa colony, which is today Namibia, the Germans perpetrated the first genocide of the 20th century. That was between 1904 and 1908. And in that colony, they had a written order to murder every man, woman, and child. They killed 80,000 Nama and Herero people. They had concentration camps. They put people on cattle cars to send them to concentration camps. They used mass starvation. So methods we would later see at Dachau and at Auschwitz were already in the works here. And there are debates among scholars about the degree to which this served as a direct precedent. But there are some interesting tie-ins. One of the people serving in that genocide later bought the Nazi newspaper and dedicated it to the Nazis. In addition, the Nazi brown shirts were actually colonial uniforms that were no longer in use because when the Treaty of Versailles shrunk German territory and inflicted penalties, they actually stripped away Germany's colonies too. And that's not something I see emphasized as much. But when you go back and look at all the newspapers between the Hitler's coup attempt in 23 and when the war starts and the invasion of Poland, a constant theme is Hitler drumming for the return of the African colonies. That was part of his vision of what greatness meant for Germany, was dominating other people. So part of the point of this here is that the colonial world that gave us the slave trade and the racial ideology to rationalize that became a source for racial thinking for the Nazis. So the Nazis clearly built upon existing religious anti-Semitism, but their introduction of this racialized anti-Semitism is one of the other key pillars of the Holocaust in this sense. So I like to express it this way. In race, the Nazis found a new weapon for their anti-Semitic arsenal. And those two things combined and were used there. So if you flip back for a moment to the previous slide, the map, we have the empires and who's president at this time when you have the end of World War One? It's Woodrow Wilson, who grew up less than a mile from the Anne Frank Center here at the University of South Carolina. It wasn't his birthplace, but where he came of age in the ruins of the Confederacy and a dedicated segregationist. So when Wilson became president, he resegregated the civil service, segregated the White House, and he seemed to have the idea that people should live with their own kind. And when he looked at Europe, he saw these empires as the source of the problem. And the solution, I think, was the notion that if people lived with their own kind, they'd be peaceful. So what you see after World War One is these empires breaking up. And all these new young countries, and they may have long cultural heritage and previous identities as empires, et cetera. But from this map, you get Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Poland, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Czechoslovakia emerge as separate independent countries. Now, every group of people with at least 1 million members gets their own independent country in Europe at this time, with two exceptions, right? The Jews and the Roma. Who's most vulnerable then when they're trapped between Hitler and Stalin? So here we are with the Europe and the transformation of Europe. One of the other observations I'd make about this is growing up in the United States, my lifetime, the borders were all very stable. If you grew up in Europe at this period, the notion of regularly shifting borders was one that was maybe commonplace or the norm. It's a different way of experiencing the world and thinking about what's possible. Okay, so we can pull out of the slideshow here, and I'll just make a few remarks here at the end. We have a new world where stuff is getting pushed at us on our devices, and children are on their devices 4 hours a day. When I was in school, teachers provided me a mountain of truth to consume, and I consumed it. There was more or less the idea you could trust what was pushed at us. That kind of approach won't work with the new world kids are living in. We have them on phones where any kind of stuff is accessible or getting thrown at them and hope that they can filter it themselves and be unaffected by it. But we can't be unaffected by what we consume. So we need a deeper approach to handle what kinds of things are being thrown at kids. I think today there's less importance for us to carry around all that information permanently in our own heads when we can access information quickly and easily. I think what skills we need now are not to contain mountains of truth in our heads, but rather to focus on how do we know it's true. The Dylan Roof case, which was so awful, he found a website on supposed black on white crime rates, and he fell for it. And if he had had the wherewithal to simply ask one question, is it true and how do I know? What's the evidence? He could have debunked it in 5 minutes, but he didn't. If we can help people ask that question, learn to ask that question and answer it well, what's the evidence? Is it true? And how do we know? How can we find out? That's going to protect a lot of people from falling down the rabbit holes that are out there. But that's only one element of it because some will still fall down those rabbit holes. Now, in Dylan Roof's case, he told people what he intended to do, and they didn't take him seriously or act on it. They had an opportunity to be upstanders, and they didn't follow it. In the case of Anne Frank and Otto Frank, we only have the diary because a group of people was willing to put their lives on the line to protect others. They're the righteous among nations, and we celebrate them. But there weren't enough to stop 6 million Jewish people from being murdered. And I think the key thing we have to remember there is we can't rely on heroic individuals alone, right? We need to build communities of upstanders. And I think that's something that we can contribute to. When people learn the Diary of Anne Frank, when they go through our programs and spend 2 days becoming guides for the traveling exhibits, they learn about Miep Gies and the other helpers, what they did, how they worked together to keep Anne alive for 25 months. It was an outstanding achievement, just one that's hard to celebrate given their ultimate fate. But that willingness, that moral resolve to work together to protect others, that's something we can build before it's too late. We want it in place before it's needed. Because if we build a moral consensus that we need to stand up together, it gets easier to stand up knowing someone else has your back and vice versa. So, building communities of upstanders, building a culture of evidence, those two are two of the goals that I think we need to pursue. And the third, I love to quote from Otto Frank himself. He just spoke so beautifully. When the Anne Frank House opened, and you can find this clip on the web, he talked about what he was trying to achieve, what they were trying to achieve. And they had an international youth network, which we're reviving this summer. And in the youth network, they brought young people to Amsterdam. And Otto said, our duty and our aim is to bring young people together and help them understand one another. Whether you're black or white or yellow, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, or Jewish, we can discover that we may be different, but we have to live in one world and we can get along very nicely. And it was that spirit that no one wants war. Otto survived Auschwitz. He survived the trenches of World War I, and he still felt that no one wants war and that they could do their part to bring young people together, help them understand one another, and avoid conflict in the world. Well, understanding one another, I think, is fundamentally cultural work, and that's something that we can do a lot to support and help one another with. So I like to finish with Otto's sentiments. I'll stop there for the moment. Happy to go into some discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doyle. There's a lot of information to unpack there. We've got a couple questions that I want to kind of put in front of you. One in particular, how do you think our understanding of Anne Frank has changed over the decades?
Terrific question. We have slightly different versions of the diary in different languages as they were translated. And getting to understand Anne through her words, even the version of the diary that we had with its omissions, I think is the most direct way. I think once you get the play in the film, some people know her story through those sources. And of course, those are also incomplete retellings rather than straight from the source. And as any historian would, you always want to go back to the original source. And as the person who worked with the diary the most from the Netherlands Institute of Foreign Documentation pointed out, if you don't speak Dutch, there's a lot you can't appreciate about the diary because Anne grew up speaking German, lived in a German family. And when she started writing, her Dutch was still inflected with German and she'd make simple errors. And to watch her evolution in Dutch in those 2 years she's in hiding from somebody stumbling through some, elementary grammatical mistakes to the fluid and sensitive, really master writer she became by the time she was captured is an experience in itself. And so in all our spare time, we should pick up Dutch to be able to appreciate that.
As I understand it, that's not a relatively simple language to just sort of pick up on the side, but I could be wrong.
I don't think any languages are simple to pick up on the side, but some certainly are harder than others. I think Dutch is a good place to start for a lot of us.
Perfect. Another question came in. Dara Horn was very critical of the world's interest in Anne Frank over other Holocaust stories.
Mhm.
How would you respond to her argument?
I have sympathy for, I think, the sentiment behind her argument.
Mhm.
What I feel though is that there's kind of this number one criticism of Otto Frank for his choices, and I personally don't feel that I would criticize Otto Frank or see myself as somebody who could. I think Otto Frank, and this is my personal view, had a theory that the key is for us to recognize one another's humanity first, that it's a sequence. First, we recognize one another's common humanity. Then we can recognize and work through differences that do exist, and differences can and do exist. So I think that's part of it. The second is that it's extraordinary that Anne attracted the attention and interest she did. Globally, there's 100 Christians, 100 Muslims, 100 citizens of India, and 100 citizens of China for each Jewish person in the world. So, in terms of proportions of the world, the Jewish community is quite small in the globe. And the interest we'd love to see all these folks have about the Jewish community in depth. I don't know how much we can reasonably expect there. What I find isn't that it's, universalism versus particularism, but rather 95% of non-Jewish people who visit an Anne Frank exhibit may not arrive caring about anti-Semitism, but their ability to relate and be interested in and concerned about parts of that story is what builds a bridge to developing specific knowledge and interest and concern about anti-Semitism. So I think what's sometimes criticized as universalism is actually an on-ramp that allows people to get in and get interested and become concerned and engage with issues such as anti-Semitism, get interested in the specifics of Jewish history, culture, and religion. So I really I see it in a different light myself.
Okay, that's great. I want to, another question kind of bounces on that kind of construct. Why do you think Anne's story resonates so deeply in American culture?
Mhm. Well, that has two aspects. It resonates all over the world in remarkable ways. And when I think about that, it's a remarkable intimacy to read her diary. And we can say whether it's actually a diary in a traditional diary sense or not. That's worth diving into a little bit. But how many people in your life do you know as intimately as you feel you know Anne after you read everything she shared with those pages? It's an extraordinary personal and intimate journey, and it's one that isn't much available to us as we, grow more distant and apart. I think there's not only, her ability to be thoughtful and creative and funny and personal and intimate, but it's compelling. It's compelling material. You have a child who's trying to make sense of a world where her government's trying to track her down and kill her. It's absolutely exceptional circumstances to be in. And watching her as she grapples with that and holds on to hope, her ability to, she has a scare where there's a break in and they thought they were done. They thought that was the end. And her response to that was, I want to go out and work for mankind. It's just an extraordinary spirit and the fierce determination not to cave into despair, facing that mighty evil is just frankly inspiring.
Wonderful, thank you. You did an incredible kind of breakdown on the ideas of the biological nonsensical construct of race versus racism as a social construct that does exist. Can
Mhm.
you discuss a little bit about the intersections between Nazi racial policies and the Jim Crow South and well, let me just say Jim Crow because it was more than
That's
the
right.
South. There were Jim Crow laws throughout the United
That's right.
States, but can you talk a little bit about that intersection for us?
Well, it's deep and fascinating. And when I mentioned Namibia, the part I forgot to include was that Eugen Fischer, an anthropologist, was down there measuring the skulls of the victims, and
Hmm.
his research on the quote unquote, bastards. led to a ban on racial mixing in Germany in 1913 because he was arguing that the children of the German soldiers and the African women were inferior. And that eugenics materials was going back and forth across the Atlantic and influencing across the Atlantic. What I didn't know when I started this and learned about the Untermensch concept is that the Nazis took that straight from the Ku Klux Klan. That KKK concept was actually a Harvard PhD named Lothrop Stoddard, 1923. He was a fluent German speaker. To my knowledge, he's the last American to meet and interview Hitler during the war, fluent in German, and coined the concept Untermensch in English as Underman in that book. And so the depth of influences across the Atlantic, of course, there's a famous book, Hitler's American Model, that talks about how the Nazis sent lawyers on a study tour of Jim Crow, but also of the immigration restrictions that helped to keep the Frank family from getting to the U.S., Otto from getting back to the U.S., American Indian law, as it was called, and second-class citizenship for Black Americans. And part of what's painful for Americans about getting exposed to Mein Kampf is he held up the worst part of American history as his model for what he wanted for Germany. There's a remarkable story about Milton Wright, who became a professor, a man from Georgia, went to get his PhD at Heidelberg University, the same place Otto Frank studied, and he attended a Hitler rally in 32 and cracked a joke to his friends. He said, "If I had my rifle, I'd shoot him now." Well, somebody heard that, reported it back to Hitler. Hitler thought the black guy was there to kill him. So he sends the SA to grab him and bring him in. Wright has no idea what's going on, and he's ushered into a one-on-one meeting with a furious Hitler. And in that meeting, according to Milton Wright, it's extraordinary. Hitler talked about Booker T. Washington, Paul Robeson, the Scottsboro Boys, Jack Johnson, Josephine Baker. I mean, he was deeply informed, utterly racist, but deeply informed about Black life in the U.S. And you can find a scan of that article from Ebony Magazine in 1950. But what's so hard reading that magazine article now for me here in South Carolina is so much of it is almost word for word what came out of Dylan Roof's mouth. You know, it's
Mhm.
the same garbage 80 years later, and we've got to find a way to tackle it.
Yeah, and he was a big fan of our 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which limited immigration, which I just found out in my studies that one of the main supporter of that, Johnson, is actually was a representative from here in Washington State.
Mm.
But and Madison Grant,
Madison
Madison
Grant.
Grant's book, yeah, um,
Well, I like to add one thing here
yeah,
because you know, for Martin Luther King to imagine a world without racism when he knew Jim Crow, you know, is
Mhm.
extraordinary. And for Otto Frank to imagine a world without anti-Semitism after he experienced Auschwitz would be incredible. But it's just the first step, and this is what's important to recognize when you're a decade or so after the Civil War in the United States. You have advocates who want to just murder the rest of the native peoples of the continent,
Mhm.
and others who said no, we can teach them English and convert them to Christianity. And of course, that was the boarding school nightmare. They would kidnap the children, take them to schools, force them not to speak their language, only to speak English, convert to Christianity. These schools had their own cemeteries. They were nightmarish. But the paradox of that is that they were examples of racial tolerance, right? That was an example of racial acceptance.
Mhm.
But if you only have racial acceptance without cultural difference, it can still be genocidal. So it's not enough just to remove hate and have a world, you know, without race and without anti-Semitism. You need to get through that to positive understanding, right? To paraphrase that Martin Luther King line, it's not a negative peace, which is the absence of hatred. It's a positive peace, which is the presence of understanding, and that's ultimately where we need to get to. And I think Otto Frank put his finger on it. It's cultural work.
Absolutely. No, you kind of open this up. USC does a play on Anne and Martin, or Anne and Emmett. Can you talk a little bit about those and how they're
There are
received?
two plays. There are two
Yeah.
plays. The Anne Frank Center USA has a wonderful play called Anne and Martin, and it builds on the coincidence that they were exactly the same name. There's
Mhm.
also an extraordinary play called Anne and Emmett, and that one is poses a meeting between Anne and Emmett, kind of in a limbo where they share their experiences. And I was at the European debut of that in Amsterdam with my students on a study abroad. And that was an exceptional play and performance too. It's one I hope that we can find a way to nurture and support and get out there in the world, because what I've found here in South Carolina is that everyone benefits when we bring our histories into dialogue. It's not that we're comparing or ranking in that kind of hierarchical sense, but that these shed light on one another and help us understand each other. And anytime we do that, we benefit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doyle. Thank you for your time with us today, and just for sharing your insights and your scholarship. We're so thankful for that. So thank you for that.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thanks for having
Okay.
me.
Thank you. Um, Thank you all for being here today. I want to let you know that our next lunch and learn program will be Tuesday, May 13th. Developed in conjunction with the HCH's legal committee, it will feature a conversation about the Magnitsky Act in light of the efforts to seize assets from oligarchs, with the goal of holding violators accountable and supporting victims, especially in Ukraine. Also, just a reminder that the Anne Frank exhibit, Let Me Be Myself, continues here at the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle until the end of May. The center is going to be open to the public on Thursdays from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. and on Sundays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. through the end of May. Make sure to check out our website for information and to plan your visit. If you haven't already registered, we also invite you to join us for our in-person Yom HaShoah program on Sunday, April 27th. In tandem with the traveling Anne Frank exhibit that's in our center, we will host a conversation with Holocaust survivors from the Netherlands, Loreen Nussbaum and Peter Metzler, as well as Ina Marie van Dam, who will share her mother's story of survival. On the 80th anniversary of liberation, these survivors will reflect on their varied experience surviving the Holocaust and their journeys after liberation. Please see our website for more details and to register. And if you find this program meaningful, and please consider making a donation. Your donation makes this programming and the education work we do possible. You can find a link on our website if you're interested. And of course, all this work is possible because we have the most outstanding and dedicated team at the Holocaust Center. Special thanks to Richard Green, who's working behind the scenes on this program to ensure its success. And a thank you to our entire team, our CEO, Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, Jessica Michaels, Paul Regelbrug, Lori Warshall-Cohen, Charlotte Campbell, Lisa Spink, Michael Langenberg, Liz Hall, Arlene Lugtu, Jess Allen, Mario Philippe Bamonte, Cheryl Harmon, and Rosa Campos. And thank you all for watching and being in dialogue with us today. We look forward to seeing you in our next Lunch and Learn program in May. Have a great day.